can I have a vertiport, at my house? Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe I might shy away from, being referred to as gang leader, or maybe I'm not clicking on these articles, and so they're not being
Yeah,
able to
filtering
read.
that noise out. Yeah. Hey, welcome to the Air Mobility Show with your host Amad Malik. Today's guest is a veteran of the aviation industry from a US Air Force background and founded the Advanced Air Mobility Institute. Very knowledgeable guy for the AAM industry. Please welcome with me, Dan Sloat. Hi, Dan. How are you doing, man?
I'm very well, Ahmad. I'm honored to be here. Happy to partake in this show. Of course, I have to stay humble and explicitly decline, any kind of excessive compliments here. But I'm very passionate about this space, and such
You
a
and me
core.
both.
Yeah, and that's part of what's so exciting is that there's this whole kind of global community that is, equally as passionate and excited to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get started into the AAM, just a quick conversation about, what's your background and where you come from, just so that people who don't know you, the viewers, can get to know you a little bit better.
I was very fortunate to have grown up in the air capital of the world, Wichita, Kansas. My hometown earned that moniker having actually produced over 300,000 aircraft thus far. And anyone who works in the aircraft manufacturing space knows that that is far and beyond any other city. And I remember growing up and, as a young child thinking that's just what grown-ups do. I swear every other parent of my friends was an aerospace engineer or worked in a manufacturing plant building aircraft. And so that left an indelible mark on me. I knew that I had to earn a pilot's license at some point. I earned an Air Force RTC scholarship out of high school, went on to study at the Kelley School of Business, Indiana University. Go Hoosiers. Really enjoyed my time in Bloomington. Ended up commissioning in 2009. Served 6 years active duty as an officer in the U.S. Air Force. And it was actually during my first deployment that I got some firsthand operational experience into what's now known as advanced air mobility. It was my job to orchestrate the safe and efficient navigation of surveillance drones, and really at any point in time at least 100. So it's pretty dynamic environment, but I was able to see just how powerful these platforms can be. And now this AM effort to adapt that technology for civilian use. Gosh, to me, it's very thrilling to think about getting these in the hands of first responders and just the sheer positive impact that they're going to make on communities around the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting topic that there was a concept that I read about this, where a search and rescue, they use swarm of drones for the search part, where they can just go out, spread around in whatever radius or mile radius that you are starting with, and canvas the whole area. Emergency services, absolutely, is one of the very close to my heart points. Yeah, and close to my heart is because just earlier this year, my younger sister passed away,
Mm,
and primarily because she was in Dubai just after the floods, and obviously there was a lot of problems, and she had a heart failure, and the ambulance couldn't reach the hospital in time. I mean, imagine having you know drone ambulances or air ambulances. But already things are happening. It's not just a theory anymore, right? That's the
right,
exciting part.
right, right. And well, and you made an excellent point, Ahmad. It's the intent here really isn't to completely reinvent the wheel. A lot of these platforms are brilliant as complementary tools for our first responders. And it will take a bit of time to develop the appropriate tactics, techniques, and procedures for how to integrate them safely and effectively. And to me, I always come back to this notion of just like with people, right? You only have one shot at a good first impression. So a big reason why we launched the Advanced Air Mobility Institute, our 501c3 international nonprofit research center, was to do our part to try to help foster a positive environment and facilitate that put our best foot forward, try to make the strongest first impression that we could. And we really do believe not only do use cases that prioritize the public safety mission result in objective good, right? Lives being saved or injuries being avoided. I think we'll find that it'll have an incredible impact on the follow-on use cases, right? If people come to first associate advanced air mobility technology with that public good, I don't think it will. I don't think we'll have to wait that long to then start introducing other more commercial use cases. But it does make sense, right? To the extent that tax dollars are being spent, I'm certain people will prefer that they go to some kind of clear, crystal clear benefit to their community and to society at large, rather than for example, helping rich people skip out on traffic.
The thing is, there's no point arguing with it because the naysayers will be there and they will say the same.
They'll find
We've seen it
something.
so many times, right? I mean,
Yeah.
internet and you know, electric cars, and there are always people who don't. But the point is, coming from somebody who's in technology, somebody who is an engineer, is kind of a little bit disappointing. But I think the potential influence overall in the commercial industry and transportation and sustainability, I think that's the biggest impact we are hoping for. I mean, that's why this is designed, right? So, what's your opinion on how much of an influence it will be when you look at urban, regional, because that's the immediate use case, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, your point about getting grief from naysayers and how many people are quick to say, well, this will only benefit high net worth individuals. Frankly, I don't. Maybe I'm not listening for it, and that's why. But or maybe I'm not clicking on these articles, and so I'm not. They're not being
Yeah,
added to the
filtering
feed.
that noise out. Yeah.
Yeah, but I can't remember ever seeing anyone getting grief. If they're a private jet aerospace engineer, right? They're developing some new, more efficient flaps or winglets or whatever the case. I don't hear them getting grief about, well, what you're doing will only benefit high net worth individuals. Well, that's their their target customer. It doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. Where we have to be careful is to the extent that governments are being asked to, right, like in Germany, for example, when governments are being asked to step in and kind of fill investor gaps. At that point, I think you have to be very careful and very clear about how this is benefiting the broader set of the population.
So, what's your view about integration and infrastructure needs, and how do you envisage this to happen? I mean, in your view.
Well, so there's I have kind of two primary roles as founder and president of the Advanced Air Mobility Institute, but I also serve as president of Electro Aero. This is an Australian based company where we produce aviation grade electric charging, the physical hardware to recharge these electric aircraft. And there's a few aircraft that are offering the charging system as kind of a package deal. But quite a few are, understandably, all of their focus is going, straight into the vehicle development itself and prioritizing the type certification. But we're going to be impacting the local electrical grid, once this starts to
In a big
scale
way,
up,
yeah.
right? So it's I think actually quite inappropriate to just assume that any given airport has sufficient grid capacity to support any number of electric aircraft. So what I'm driving towards is this notion that yes, of course we need the charging infrastructure, but a precursor to that even is engaging in the energy availability studies, right, to make sure that this is feasible in the first place. So that's, I think, the very, very first step. Any community that would like to introduce and integrate electric aviation needs to have a clear sense of where they're at as far as grid capacity at the moment, what the costs involved to introduce more capacity if that's what's needed. It's not enough that we simply increase capacity. I think if AAM is to stay true to those foundational principles of sustainability, we have to make sure that the increased capacity involves clean and new electric generation, right, from renewable sources. Certainly solar. Unfortunately, wind presents a number of challenges to aviation, right, in the form of takeoff and landing approach. But recently I've been learning more about, for example, continual river current generation. Certainly in the urban air mobility environment, the highest demand is going to almost certainly coincide with you know the most compact and congested parts of a downtown. If we can add vertiports at those, on barges, fix river current generation, then not only can we increase the capacity and make use of these electric, in particular eVTOL.
We have to combine a number of technologies because the production capability of these sustainable energy creation. Portugal have been able to achieve 100% energy creation and consumption from sustainable sources. So I think that is hand in hand, but I think the infrastructure point, which I was referring to, is more my concern around how to integrate so the services can be really delivered in and on your doorstep or close to your doorstep, because that's the last mile problem that we are trying to solve. We already have the airports, and we already have the regional airports, and that can be developed. It's already there. We're talking about city planners and stuff, and that's a very different kind of mindset, right?
You're absolutely right, Ahmad. And for a period there was all sorts of, well, I think maybe it was high hopes that, can I have a vertiport, at my house? I think it's hard to see, the extent of last mile, like we see with, the personal automobile, where you drive it literally right into an attached garage. It's hard to envision that level of, last mile convenience for this space,
Yeah,
for some
I
time to
completely
come.
agree
But
with you. I don't think we are trying to replace cars altogether, right?
yeah,
I think what we need to do is find a way where, from a low congestion area, you can reach a destination within that low congestion area where you can jump into something, sort of a central hub, not in your driveway. I think that even if the technology can make that happen, we're a bit far away, right?
absolutely. I think certainly at the neighborhood level is feasible at some point. There already are communities, where you can fly in, right? There's a kind of a
Yeah,
shared runway.
in the US, unfortunately, not many places outside of US.
Right.
Trust me, I'm very pissed off about it that I don't have any possibility like
Yeah.
that in
Yeah.
Europe, where I live, because I would love to buy a house where I can
Yeah.
just taxi out from my
Right.
garage right on the runway. That would be amazing. But yeah, no, sorry.
We have something like 5,000 regional airports that are underutilized. And so there's a push to say, well, how about these, this new class of electric aircraft utilize those GA and regional airports. And I think that's a great place to start. And I would definitely make use of a service like that, depending on the cost. But because it's a real hassle, showing up 2 hours early and then you got to fight through all the security. If security was more decentralized, that at least, some amount of people were, getting checked, their person and their luggage before they
You're
even
essentially
arrived.
offloading the workload, right? You're offloading the
Yeah.
workload to the sort of smaller areas where it can
Yeah.
be tackled, and then you bring everyone in the hub.
Yeah.
Just as a transit rather than spending hours in security. Yeah, absolutely, I think it makes absolute sense. But I think my sort of concern is where you don't have those facilities, especially as outside of US. So if you look at Dubai or Middle East, it's kind of a use case where you don't have those regional or GA airports as much. and they really are pushing to adopt this capability as soon as possible. So there you have no other choice but to build some new infrastructure or opportunity to be more sort of specific vertiport style infrastructure. They can design it into the cities, right? That is more sort of easy to do than, let's say, integrating New York City or Chicago or London or Paris, because you have all these buildings, they are very congested. It will take something to bring that into the network, right? So that's a problem. And talking about that, I also want to just touch about responsibility or engagement from the agencies and the governments.
Mm.
And how do you envisage that collaboration to happen, and what is needed to make that happen? Because my concern is, we are running into a problem very soon where all these things flying around and we're not really looking at how we are going to manage all of that. So
Hmm.
what's your view?
Yeah, and I think this actually ties into an additional point from your prior question about, on the infrastructure side. It's certainly been the purview of governments for quite some time to take tax dollars and invest in, making transportation more accessible, safer, and efficient. Right, it has enormous implications on commerce, and of course that's government's number one job, is to keep people safe. So, and of course there's a
And
strong tie
keep the
into.
economy running, and
Yeah. Yeah,
uh,
you gotta do all those things.
you
So
got to do all those things so people can have jobs. And
right, right. So, it's actually, I think if AAM operations only ever happen between existing airports, then not that there wasn't a point, but I think we'll have fallen well, well short of its potential. And to your point, certainly in countries where they don't have a surplus of underutilized airports to start with, yeah, we have to make use of these vertiports. And so those kind of jump right into that aspect. And I would say, because even relatively small local and regional airports, they don't need this near the same footprint, right, as an international or world rated runway, but they still need quite a lot of space. And generally speaking, that amount of space does not coincide with where there's high demand in terms of destination. And so, I was reading about a project recently in the UAE to open the first casino. To me, that can be an excellent showcase for this, in
perfect use
that,
case, yeah.
yeah, and that I think very quickly we'll need to be smart about citing vertiports directly at places of interest. No one no one flies to an airport and they're like, okay, I'm done. This was my destination. Right?
No,
Airports are always just, okay. You got me within an hour of New Orleans.
yeah.
Now what mode am I going to take to get to my hotel, or this celebration, or whatever the case.
Yeah, and I think that's where opportunity also lies, right? So they
Yeah.
can test this out. It's a greenfield environment for you in a way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you look at the whole overall, let's say UAE overall, and this casino and the new airport that they are building, one of the biggest, it will be one of the biggest airports in the world. The casinos are going to be in Ras Al Khaimah sort of as a place, or around. So there are a lot of localities and regions which are an hour drive, hour and a half drive, which is easily something that can be covered within the range of the EV tolls that we have
Oh
right
yeah.
now,
Yeah.
existing technology. We're talking about 15, 20 minutes flight maximum, I mean, in a straight line. And you can easily service these places.
Yes, and that reminds me, actually, just earlier today. So I sit on the World Economic Forum Aviate Committee. I mean, we were having a bit of a brainstorming session. What I'd shared with the committee is some recent discussions at the AAM Institute about, for example, what if we brought together, a major sports stadium, as well as its host city, and we budget a pair of vertiports, and let's say two or three eVTOLs. Start small, and they split costs, and perhaps, for example, American football plays on Sundays during the season, and so, right, maybe it's Sundays they're ferrying passengers and season ticket holders, right? So maybe 3 days of the week, the stadium owners, make general use of it, and then the other 4 days, it's perpetually utilized to complement those air medical services, to go out to especially more remote and rural neighborhoods within that, that greater London, for example, especially those communities that are outside of the golden hour, right? That it would take longer than 30 minutes to reach, and therefore longer than an hour to get back to, a proper emergency room facility. That I think that would be a really interesting kind of innovative business model, right? Where we tap into a bit of, government funding, but for an unmistakable public good, but at the same time not lean entirely on the government to cover.
Yeah,
NFL stadium owners have quite a bit of extra
quite a bit of
money,
money. Yeah.
generally speaking.
I actually recently had a chance to watch an NFL match here in London in Wembley Stadium. The thing is, yeah, it's so congested. It becomes a big bottleneck for the entire area, for the entire community as well. Getting out and getting in, and they try to do a very good job. But yeah, I think there is still propensity to have multiple ways of running those services. So I want to go back to AAM Institute now that I have actually joined as well.
Yes.
Let's talk about the institute and let's talk about the structure of the organization. So, what is the dream for this organization, and what do you hope that we can do with the people who are involved? And it's a really good big group of people now that
Yeah.
are included into that. So as a president, as a leader of that gang, if you may,
Yeah.
what's the plan, man?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe I might shy away from, being referred to as gang leader. But we have some absolutely brilliant people on the team, yourself included, Ahmad. Yeah, we have about 250 members worldwide across 70 different countries. So it's been an incredible growth. Our structure is generally, of course, we have as a nonprofit, we have a board of directors who votes on the financial decisions for the organization. We're building out a staff that will have very specific individual contributor roles, of course, with our public acceptance mission. We look to our director of public relations. I'll give Kristen a shout out. She does fantastic work for us, producing high quality press releases almost on a weekly basis. We also have a research council, and the original intent of the research council was actually to provide a bit of camaraderie among graduate and PhD candidates who are studying some facet of advanced air mobility. Because it's such a new space, I mean, there are a number of students where they're quite literally the only person in their entire university who's even familiar with this, let alone studying it intently. And there's already been some benefits in, sharing of resources, and at times, I've said it on meetings where they say, I wish XYZ tool existed because it's a real hurdle for my research. And another student will chime in and say, I had that same issue and I built a solution myself and I'm happy to pass it on. All the work I put in, someone else, might as well benefit. And so you see instances like that, and it's really fantastic to see. And we have a student showcase each May, really to try to help highlight how talented these scholars are to industry, and hopefully do our part to help them, not only for them to land good jobs, but for the industry to see just how accomplished these young graduates are, and the kind of new fresh ideas that they can bring to the table and add value immediately, and to really illustrate the opportunities in markets that are historically kind of overlooked. For example, I think there's so much potential throughout Latin America, throughout Africa, as well as Southeast Asia, what's kind of like generally referred to as global South. I think the Indian market is going to be phenomenal, because as I understand, traffic congestion is pretty substantial. I will say that I don't. I have a hard time seeing that we can scale up eVTOLs at a pace that will exceed the new drivers. For traffic itself, I have a hard time seeing that we'll see a meaningful decrease. The benefit is for the people who are in the aircraft,
Yeah,
right? Not for
yeah.
society overall.
I think you're absolutely right. The way I look at it, it's not just going to replace your cars
Right.
and normal traffic, right? I think it's more than just replacing something with something new, at least not in the next 5, 10 years. It's more to improve the quality of life overall, the ability of getting places where, mitigating the congestion problem to some
Mm-hmm.
extent for those who will be lucky enough to be able to afford it initially, because it's still going to be expensive, right? I mean, even though we are aiming for a general public reachable kind of a thing, a normal middle class person should be able to afford it, but until that happens. Same with the electric cars, right? Model S was quite expensive, but Model 3 now everyone can buy. I think it's just a quality of life thing. I think a very good use case. You mentioned Southeast Asia. You have all these countries who are islands, and you have a lot of island hopping, which is done over ferries, which is very dependent on the conditions. You also have the speed limitation on water. How
Yeah.
many nautical miles you can do. But related to that, and I think we had a very brief discussion around it. You've probably seen the work that I have been doing under unified air
Hmm.
mobility management. How do you think both things are kind of complementing each other, or is it something that you think is a right direction to go to? Because in my view, something that provides a 360-degree framework for all these facets which are not traditionally studied in the aviation industry. And now we have to. I mean, me, an AI guy, I have to go out and learn about, smart city development. I think it's a challenge, right? How do you think the institute, if I say that, we make that open source project like we discussed, what's the role for these two projects in your view?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. It's kind of that fourth pillar, what we call an industry roundtable, is where we house a number of working groups and task forces that have a much more focused approach. And it sounds like there's a lot of complementary elements between your open source projects and our efforts at the industry roundtable. Because historically, we brought in folks with relatively niche expertise, and we kept an eye out for projects and papers where that expertise was necessary and added value. But now we've grown to such an extent, we need a lot more structure. And projects like this that are aimed ultimately towards the public benefit, would we be able to sustain completely free providing advice and guidance to government decision makers? To me, it's a classic, you get what you pay for. you know we found a lot of really passionate people who've been willing to be generous with their time and their insights. But if we're going to convince people to engage in a deep dive research and thorough report writing, of course I'm going to advocate on behalf of those people and make sure that they're paid a fair wage. But the price point is going to be dramatically less than some of the bigger, flashier name
Yeah.
consulting firms.
I think you're spot on that, and it's not about that there is no cost because it's a non-profit.
Yeah.
It's that there's no profit. That's the only thing. There's still
Right.
cost,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I think the benefit of this is twofold. One is that you're doing things on cost. That's
Mm.
why
Right.
it's non-profit. So you're doing
Right.
things on cost. So whatever is produced is going to be much cheaper than for profit. And I think second point is that it's always going to be unbiased or should be unbiased. The information that you are going to get is not going to be influenced by an agency is heavily you're reliant on for your day-to-day work, because that's where the money is coming from, right? And you're not trying to sell a service. So I think that's where they come, and this is why I started the open source project, because I think the open source project is just information.
Well, what's excellent about it is it helps to resolve, that classic research problem of, if you don't have a clear sense of, kind of the broader, more comprehensive, and in a perfect world, exhaustive list of factors, considerations, stakeholders, and so forth. If you just don't know that another element is out there, then you can't possibly then proceed with the more rigorous research. So I think that's where a lot of the value in your open source project lies, is one, helping people who are new to the space much more quickly get spun up in an accessible way, as well as individuals who maybe this is their whole livelihood, stay abreast of new entrants, new factors that perhaps we weren't aware of, or didn't fully appreciate when the industry was first kicking off.
Yeah, I think completely agree. I think it's an opportunity and also a time to give back to the industry and
Yeah.
help this little baby grow up and be stronger. And I think one of the things that we need to learn from the IT industry, especially for the aviation industry, is that concept of open source. Because aviation industry is very much close to heart, IP, secretive, and don't share. And the
Mm.
first time I talked about the open source project between a bunch of aviation people is like, okay, but what do you want? Obviously they don't understand what open source means, and hopefully now that technology in aviation and IT are getting much closer, especially with the introduction of AI and everything else. And Dan, it was a very interesting conversation, and talking about this entire industry, and this little baby that we are kind of nurturing, and we are very passionate about. Anything that you want to say in terms of you know industry or people in the industry right now?
Yes. So actually, just last night, I was invited by a colleague of mine, Kurt Barnhart, to share some thoughts, kind of an industry discussion for a number of Kansas State University aerospace campus students. One of the questions that he posed was, for example, if any of the attendees perhaps hadn't chosen aerospace engineering as their pathway now as a young adult, if advanced mobility has kind of piqued their interest, is it too late? Right? Can they still be involved in some way? And it's a question I hadn't heard in this industry thus far. I think it's very timely because as we continue to grow the public awareness, I very much hope that we not only inspire people, well, inspire their trust, but we also inspire people to join and to try to contribute. And one of the most important reasons why we started the AAM Institute was to very much be open arms and, kind of stay true to our word that anyone who wants to be involved, that we will work tirelessly to find meaningful opportunities for them to contribute. Granted, we're not building the aircraft, so we're not going to hand anyone a wrench and have them get to work in that capacity. But ultimately, what we're talking about is a new mode of transportation, how we move people and goods. And so there's so many facets of this. We will need an incredible diversity of talents and skills. And so certainly for any listeners to this show who would like to learn more, would like to see how they too can get involved, by all means do reach out. Our website, aaminstitute.org. We keep that updated with the latest industry news and our initiatives. Yeah, we strive to be welcoming and inclusive as possible.
Yeah, and I think it's high time that the next generation, next crop of engineers is sort of mentored into this. And obviously I'm also, as doing my part at mentoring ASU students, mostly the research students, into the in AAM programs, which is kind of run by Honeywell. So I've had my first batch of students last year, and this year will be now new. So I think for people like yourself, and it's admirable the work that you are doing. We need to kind of come together and help everyone, and I think there's a huge potential. Very excited about the future. That the time of the time we are alive is just exciting. There's so much happening in the world, in the
Yes.
artificial intelligence, in advanced air mobility, even in aerospace, in space, and so on. It's fantastic, exciting times, and really enjoyed your time, Dan. Lovely to have you, and you're always welcome. By the way, the link to the institute will be in description. So yeah, fantastic, man. It was lovely to have you, and you're always welcome at the podcast. Whenever you are free, just dial in. Yeah, and thank you everyone for joining, everyone for listening, and hopefully you enjoyed. Like and subscribe. See you next time. Bye bye.